I'm ready for glue up now. So I've got all my parts sanded. So I've got the four legs. I've sanded all the faces, rounded the edges. I've chamfered the bottoms. I've got my glue blocks ready to go. I've got the front and back and side aprons. So I've got longer clamps for the front and back and some shorter clamps for the sides. I do need to get some cawls so that the clamps don't leave impressions on the legs. So I'm going to do a quick clamp up just to make sure everything's all situated, and then I'll glue the parts together. So I've got the table dry clamped. I want to make sure, my process, the order of operations, I want to make sure my clamps are all set up. So a couple things to point out. I've got cawls on under every clamp, and they're just a 1/4 inch MDF, about 1 inch by 3 inches. And I do that because they sit on the table here and or on the bench, and they just, by gravity, they just sit in place there. To make sure the clamps are aligned, and that's always critical. You don't want to put a clamp on crooked and have it pull the project out of square. So the best way to do that is to use part of the project as a reference. So each of these clamps, like these short ones here, they're sitting on the aprons. So that means I know they're aligned this way, and then if I look at the gap here, I also know they're aligned this way. I can kind of just eyeball that too. And then these longer clamps, they're sitting on these other clamps, so I know they're aligned horizontally, and once again, I've got them, in this case, up against the legs here, so I also know they're aligned that way. So I'm confident that's fine. I had to move some stuff out of my tool tray. It was in the way, so everything's good to go. I want to point out that if you don't have this piece on your apron, if you made your drawer a little bigger and you only have this, then do not put a clamp across here. In that case, if you don't have this piece, you need to clamp here and you need to clamp here. If you try to put a clamp all the way across and this isn't here, you're gonna bend this and everything's gonna go out of whack. So I'll unclamp this. We'll put the glue on the mortises and tenons and put it together one last time. I'm ready to go. Got everything apart, got my glue, and for me, I've got a glue stick. Now, I'm not a fan of the glue brushes, the acid brushes that a lot of people like to use. I'll use them in certain situations, but when I'm trying to get down inside a mortise, I find this stick works better than a brush. The bristles tend to stick out, and I end up making more of a mess. So I'm a glue stick person when it comes to this. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to squirt glue on both sides of the mortise. So it's going to run down inside there. And I'll use the stick, right? That would be hard to do with a brush. And make sure both faces of the mortise have glue on them. It's really important that the surfaces are wet with glue. I'll do that on all of these. I'm trying not to get too much glue on the face of the leg here, but it's kind of hard not to. I'll just wipe that off, because if there's too much there, when the apron goes in, it's going to squeeze out. Okay, now it takes longer to put glue on the mortises than on the tenons, so I'm going to do all the mortises first. Well, at least for this back. The back half of the project. So I'm going to do the back half separate than the front half. Okay, to do the tenons, I'm going to put, now I don't want a lot of glue on the tenons because that's just going to squeeze out. So what I do on these is, once again, I want the surface wet with glue. So I'm just basically going to get the glue on there so the surface is wet, but it doesn't have to be covered with glue. Like I said, it's just going to squeeze out. So I just want to get it wet. That's the other reason I like this stick. Kind of acts as a squeegee. Yeah, I probably had a little too much glue on there. There we go. All right, so make sure that's facing the right way. That's the right rear leg. Now, I want to make sure I'm flush here. So, take my okay. Now I'm looking at my triangles here, making sure everything's going in the right direction. Okay, that looks good. Now, if say something wasn't aligned and you couldn't push it down, sometimes what helps is to kind of wiggle these a little bit to loosen up the joint, and then you can push things flat. But everything looks good. Everything's flat down against the table or the workbench. Check. Now, these don't need to be super tight, just tight enough to close up the joints. You know, it would need to be tight if I was doing a butt joint, but because the joint is this way and I'm clamping that same direction, the clamping pressure is pretty much irrelevant as long as the joint's closed up. So, good to go. So once that sets up, then I'll come back and glue in the drawer supports and the glue blocks. The glue is dry now, and I've got the clamps off. So next I want to put in the drawer supports. So I've got cawls just taped in place because they're going to be difficult to hold in place otherwise. And I've got my drawer supports here, and they're labeled left and right. Now I realize now I just test fit them. They're a touch short, but that should be okay, because remember the glue blocks are what are going to do most of the work to hold those in place. Remember, when these are in, the joint is end grain to long grain, which isn't very strong. So I'm going to use the glue blocks to reinforce that joint. So I'm not overly concerned about these being a little short. So I want to slide them in. Now this is a little bit of an awkward situation in terms of glue, because I can't open this up and clamp it. So as I slide this in, I'm going to be pushing the glue off or into the joint. So what I want to do is make sure I'm installing from the top, and I want, if anything, I want the glue to come out this top area and not get pushed down to the bottom, which is you know, not seen typically, but visible. So I'm going to put very little joint or very little glue inside these dados, and I'll put a little extra glue on the ends of these supports, and that way most of the glue squeeze out will come up as opposed to being pushed down. Now here's a situation where I want a brush. I think a brush is going to be easier to apply glue, particularly in these dados. So I've got an acid brush, and I cut the bristles short. They're typically too long, so I just use a chisel to cut those. That works a little better than scissors. I'll put some glue on here. I like to use an old piece of sandpaper for that. it's, you know, it's fairly stiff paper, so that works well. And I'm just gonna paint some glue in here. I'm not putting it all the way to the bottom. I'm stopping about 3/4 of an inch up. Once again, trying to minimize how much glue gets pushed out. Now that's the front. Now I said one end is the front, but that really doesn't matter. That's just the end that I have the letter written on. It does matter which is up and which is down though, because one side is smoother than the other. Okay, so I'm feeling the bottom on the underside here. I want that flush. I don't really care at the top. So once again, I've got the clamp resting on, there we go. So I got it resting on the aprons to help me align it, and then I can eyeball parallel this way. There we go. Same thing on the other side. Now, like I said, these are a touch short, so I don't want to clamp this too hard. I don't want to be bending aprons there. I just want this tight enough to hold it in place. Okay, and then the glue blocks, I don't really have a good way to clamp those. So I'm just going to use a rub joint. I'm going to put a little glue on here, and I'm going to rub that till they feel like they're pretty tight. And that should be enough to hold them in place. I've got long grain to long grain. It's not a highly loaded joint. Should be just fine. So put a little bit of glue. I'm putting it more towards the inside so it's less likely to squeeze out. I'm just going to rub that until it really feels, not moving it very far. And then remember, it's a 1/4 inch shorter than the apron, so I've got about 1/8 of an inch gap top and bottom there. And even with that, I did get a little bit of squeeze out there, so I'll use a little bit less on the next ones. Okay, so I'll continue to put those on, and then we'll be done with the glue up.